Where there we go. Okay, so for this individual oral commentary, I am analyzing a poem by Sylvia Plath called "The Applicant." It's published in 1965, just 2 years after her suicide. The Applicant consists of 8 stanzas with 5 lines of verse in each, and just by looking at the title, we kind of see this, we get this feeling of a very formal, maybe business-like setting of being in a job interview, or at least an interview in which one applies for a job, for example, or any position. This is further emphasized in the very first line of verse in the first stanza, which is a rhetorical question in which it says, "First, are you our sort of a person?" Which is a question that you might ask yourself before going into a job interview, or which you might will be asked, or which you will probably be asked in a job interview if you're the right kind of person. The semantic field in the rest of the stanza is dominated by these substitutions for real things, or actually these fake things, such as a glass eye, false teeth, crutch, a brace, a hook, rubber breast, a rubber crutch. So really these fake materials that are substitutes for something else, or something that you use if one is damaged or, well, not functioning correctly, so to speak. This could be expressing the fact that when you are actually applying for something, what people is going to look at is not what you can offer, it's not going to be on the inside, but it's actually very superficial. It's asking, well, they're looking more at what you have on the outside, more superficial things. The second stanza starts off with an alliteration of S, stitches to show something's missing. That's also followed by a question mark. And these questions are all through the poem, which again emphasizes this kind of setting of being in, or theme of being in a job interview, or being asked something, being, well, yeah, interviewed. And this really very much draws in the reader, as one can identify, or one can ask himself or herself those questions. But the alliteration of S's creates this flow. There's no set rhyme scheme in the poem, although there are rhymes, such as in the first stanza with crutch and crutch, which is really a play on words, as they're pronounced very similar, or exactly the same, but it's spelled 2 different ways and have 2 very different meanings. Also in the first line of verse in the second stanza, there's repetition of no, also followed by a question mark, once again emphasizing all these questions, or repeating all these questions. So it's really a repetition within a repetition. After that, in the second line of verse, it says, "How can we give you a thing?" So if you don't miss anything, how can we offer you something? Again, almost playing on this superficial, this eminent constant need of more, even though we actually don't need anything. Also in the second stanza there is a synecdoche. Here is a hand. This hand, being a body part, actually represents a person, a full person, and not just a hand. Also there's another repetition in the fifth line of verse with empty, where it's asked as a question, when empty is followed by a question mark, and then afterwards repeated with a full stop, so almost answering the question that has been put forth originally. Now this stanza is very interesting, as the mood almost shifts a little bit from before you had this feeling of a setting, a formal setting with an interview, almost like a job interview, a business setting, to really, one could argue, more about marriage, with "here is a hand," almost as if you're giving away a wife or taking a wife. And this can really be read with a feminist viewpoint as well, with the stop crying, open your hand, and also this what do you have to offer. So in a feminist viewpoint, this can be read as the woman's role in marriage, which in the 1960s, one could argue, is a very almost submissive role within marriage. These stay-at-home women who are not supposed to cry and are supposed to, well, do everything they can to keep their husbands happy. When we look at the third stanza, in the very first line of verse, there's this repetition of I and double L in to fill it and willing, which also, in a way, how Sylvia Plath uses these sounds really creates an amazing flow, one could argue. Also, there's another question within stanza number 3, which is will you marry it? And this will you marry it is actually repeated throughout the poem 4 times, emphasizing once again on this marriage aspect, this theme of marriage. Also there's Caesara. Actually there is several places, 3 places within the poem also adding to this flow, and she keeps changing between full stop and no stop and commas and question marks and so forth. When you look at the 5th stanza, really that's the only stanza within the poem where one could argue that there's an actual rhyme scheme, because it's filled with rhyme, both internal rhymes and rhyming couplets. So, black and stiff, but not a bad fit, will you marry it? It is waterproof, shatterproof, proof against fire and bombs through the roof. Believe me, they'll bury you in it. So this proof and roof and it and fit and stiff are all examples of rhyme and how it really makes the poem flow, and this makes also this specific stanza stand out as it contains so many rhymes. Also, the mood in this stanza almost switches, where in the beginning you had this feeling of it being about marriage and maybe about an interview, but in this it's almost like you switch sides. Like now you're not trying to get something, but you're actually, one could argue that in the poem, the reader of the poem actually is trying to give something away, almost as an advertisement, arguing why it's such a good thing. And again, this could be linked to marriage, where a woman is almost trying to mention all her good qualities to be the best possible wife. If we go down to the 7th stanza, you have a tricolon with it can sew, it can cook, it can talk, talk, talk. So also a repetition in the very ending with talk. And the way that Sylvia Plath in this stanza is using it instead of saying he or she makes the poem very anonymous and makes it very relatable for whoever is reading it, for the audience. This is very typical for postmodern poetry, in which the reader is supposed to, or is very often, where poetry is often very anonymous, so that the reader can really relate to it. Also, there's another couplet with look and cook, and again it adds to this, if one were to read it with a feminist viewpoint, to this sewing and cooking, which is something that was qualities of a good wife back when the poem was written. The 8th stanza also contains repetitions and a tricolon and also an anaphora. Yes, and that is about all I have for this wonderful poem by Sylvia Plath. Good night.